Everyone, my name's Dan, and this video is a hands-on demonstration of how you would implement Adobe Target server-side and what some of the advantages and disadvantages of that are. Before I start, I'll quickly introduce myself. So we'll quickly run through my LinkedIn. So, like I said, my name is Dan, and I am a digital optimization director at OptiSite, which is an agency based in London, which specializes predominantly in Adobe Target. So, I've worked with Adobe Target for quite a few years in a few of my previous roles for the last, say, 7 or 8 years. I am a bit of a mix of a kind of got a bit of a business head as well as a kind of a bit of a technical side. So I am a certified Adobe expert, as well as being a full stack JavaScript developer and a certified CXL optimizer. So before I kind of jump into the code level detail, one of the things I wanted to start on in this video was when to use server-side testing and what are the kind of advantages, because I think there's quite a few myths floating around about server-side. I used to go to quite a few events with both Optimizely and Adobe, and I'd always come across some form of non-technical marketing director or marketing manager that would always say the future of testing is to go server-side and to basically not do anything client-side. Now, I don't agree with that. And I think the best article I can find that summarizes kind of the advantages and disadvantages is this Optimizely article, and it's just this little kind of table here. So I'll zoom in and I'll talk through it from my perspective. I don't fully agree with this. I think that a lot of it is right, but some of it is somewhat outdated. So I'll just jump through all the points. And like I said, some of this is personal preference and some of this has changed over time. But the first one is deployment. So on a client-side implementation or a client-side experiment, there is no code release required, it can be an advantage and a disadvantage. The fact that you can make changes on the fly to the website and release them is a fantastic thing. It doesn't slow you down with releases, but it can also be dangerous on the flip side. And I think anyone that's worked with testing platforms long enough will have made the odd error here and there and basically brought a few websites down. I think it's par for the course. The server-side approach to deployment is that a release will be required, and with that there is some engineering time and some engineering expertise needed. It's slower, but it can be more powerful, and it can still be unit tested as per any code release, and it can be revision controlled in GitHub. It has a lot of advantages. Caching is the next one, not a big consideration for me. So client-side experimentation compatible with any CDN provider. So basically, when you go client-side, you can basically use any CDN provider because it's bringing it in after essentially the server has returned the content. Whereas on the server, treatments must be cached at a CDN layer. Again, like I said, for me, not really a big consideration. Next one, accessibility. Now, this one is a big consideration for me. So I think most people who get into testing tend to get into it more from a non-technical side. So all of the top tools these days have a WYSIWYG editor. What you see is what you get. You can go in, load your page up, you can mess around with things, and that kind of gives you the bug. So the advantage of this is that if you're a marketing team and you're non-technical and you have any of the major tools, and in all honesty, they're all from a visual editor point of view as good as each other, in my opinion. You can go in there, you can move things around, you can change colors, you can do a fair bit. So non-technically, you can go in, you can set up some tests and get some wins. You get the ball rolling. Also, client side, especially with Target, you have the form-based editor that lets you essentially run any CSS, JavaScript, or any HTML manipulation you want. So with a bit of basic, some web foundations of HTML, CSS, JavaScript, you can start to do some pretty complex things in terms of the UI and building kind of quite different variations and really get some big wins. That's fantastic. Obviously, on the server side, you can't just randomly dip your finger in the water. The expertise you need for this is very unique. It isn't just knowing a back-end language like something like Node or Express. It's having the actual knowledge of Target itself. So it isn't just a case of having a couple of developers that are part-time testing developers and 80% you're just deving other things. You really need kind of fenced off resource with this and the time to upskill developers to really make this process fluent. Otherwise, it's kind of stagnant and a bit stop-start. Implementation. So the actual implementation of Adobe Target or Optimizely or whatever it may be on the most simple level, client side, it's a piece of cake. It's basically dropping the JavaScript snippet into any tag management system, whether that be DTM launch, GTM, whatever you want, or just put it manually into the page. To add to that, there is more complex versions of a client-side implementation. So a lot of my implementations pass in bespoke things. So as the user goes around the site, the data layer of the website will get populated with certain variables, and they can be passed into the inbox via the inbox parameters, and those can allow you to target and create audiences on a more niche level. The implementation, and we'll be talking about this later on in these videos, on the server side it can be easy, it can be hard. It ultimately depends on a couple of things: the technology that you're using and the skill level of the members of staff in your team. I'm a firm believer of if you have a technical expert on the development side, regardless of what tech stack you have, you'll be fine. Some tech stacks are more difficult than others. Single page applications, Angular, React can be a bit more painful because you've got to find out where to plug them in. With the kind of life cycle events, it's not quite as simple. But again, depending on skill level, can be easy, can be hard. Performance. The performance is one I don't fully agree with anymore, as well as Flickr. So historically, Flickr and performance were an issue with client side. So you might be changing a headline, for example, and you'd often get, you see the old headline and the new headline. With newer versions, with a kind of prefetch and the pre-hiding snippets, Flickr has kind of been eradicated as kind of an issue anymore. And I think performance is kind of with that. I mean, I was just looking before starting this video, and I've got a quite complex test, quite a few lines of code, and it only is 56 kilobytes, and it's essentially deployed client side in a millisecond. And I think, like I said, with faster computers, kind of the prefetching and internet speed getting higher, I actually don't think performance is much of a consideration. Granted, server side, you'll almost have no performance impact whatsoever because it's obviously all done on the server and the client doesn't have to do anything. Privacy, again, one I don't see as a problem. I think it depends what industry you work in. So what this table is saying is that it's pretty easy if you go to a website that runs any of the major optimization tools. Client side, if you know what you're doing, you can find out if you're in a test, you can find out why you're in the test, you can find out what the code is that run the test, and you can essentially find out what your competitors are testing. For me, it's not a big issue. If you maybe work for an industry that's highly regulated or there's a lot of money in it, then maybe that becomes an issue. Server side, that's not an issue at all because all of the fetching and all the inbox calls are done server side. So by the time the content renders, there is nothing to see. So it's untraceable, as it were. And then you've got channels. So I think channels is a fair one. Ultimately, client-side implementations only allow for experimentation where there's a browser that can run JavaScript. So that's most of the time websites. It can be mobile apps, pretty simple. The newer versions of AT.js in Target now, you can use Visual Editor, so the WYSIWYG editor in mobile apps and update stuff on the fly without any kind of release to App Store. But if it was something like an ATM, or maybe you've got some kind bespoke software that runs on kind of an iPad that your company uses. It may not have JavaScript and a client you can manipulate, but it most definitely will have a server. So that's when server side can really come into its own. So a bit of a summary that ultimately client side and server side are both massively important. It does depend on what the use case is. Some of them fall definitively in one side, some of them fall in a grey area. I would always, if it is a grey area, try and do it on the client side, just because I've always found it easier that way. You can sometimes go down a blind alley with server side, but sometimes, like we've talked about, if you're trying to do things on non-JavaScript based kind of applications or something like that, it's got to be server side. Or if you're trying to do something really quite complex. So this 1, 2, 3, 4, fifth one down, depth is quite an interesting one. Just because with client side, you've ultimately only got the client to play with. So once it's rendered, you can change any UI you want. Whereas on the server side, if it's an algorithm, say it's a pricing algorithm, for example, there's no way of changing that on the fly client side because the server's already returned a price. But by running Target or any of these top tools, server side, you can obviously return different variables or different content in the server as it's rendering, which can have a different impact on an algorithm, i.e. a pricing algorithm. So I think the takeaway is that it's worth having a think about what exactly you're trying to achieve. But for me, a hybrid approach is the way to go. Why not have both tools at your disposal when you need them and make a kind of a test by test decision. And once you get a few tests in, you tend to kind of just know what fits where. So that's kind of it for a wrap up of this. Next, I'm going to move on to a bit more technical, a bit more hands-on, and how the server-side implementation works and how you call the APIs. But definitely worth keeping in mind, server-side is not the answer to everything.